Hey everyone, hope you're having a wonderful Monday. I'm here today with Julep to discuss with you guys heating options when it comes to ball python enclosures. I get this question rather regularly from various types of people, mostly new keepers or people who keep having problems when it comes to maintaining proper heat with their ball python. So hopefully you'll find this information useful as I discuss the options that I have found successful depending on the type of enclosure that you're using. So again, this is Julep, who's kind of cruising all around here. I'm Jack. This is Python Addiction. Stay tuned. Hey everyone. So, as I was saying in the introduction, there's three basic types of heating that I prefer when it comes to enclosures, and it's all going to be dependent on the type of enclosure that you're heating. With ball pythons, you want a hot side that's around 88 to 90 degrees with a cool side at around 78 to 80 degrees. So you can allow your ball python to thermoregulate as they want, going from one end of an enclosure to another, regardless of if it's a glass enclosure, a PVC enclosure, or even a rack tub or a plastic bin, whatever you're using as your enclosure. I basically recommend one of three different options for heating. The first one is the overhead lamp. Now, with the overhead lamp, I don't recommend using a light producing bulb. What I actually recommend using is a ceramic bulb. And I'm going to state this. This is going to apply for all of the heating sources. You need a quality thermostat when it comes to controlling and regulating the heat output for any of these heat sources. I have a couple, and there's a couple of pictures of a few that I think are quality thermostats. I'm not going to discuss them, their pros and cons in this video, but if you want to know more about that or have a comparison and like me to do a video on that, let me know in the comments below and I'll be happy to do that. But for the primary source, when it comes to mostly glass enclosures, will be something like this. For ball pythons, using a ceramic heat emitter. You don't need to worry about light type bulbs that produce light or anything like that. The ambient light in your room where you keep your enclosure will be more than enough to create a proper day-night cycle for their circadian rhythm. If you really want, you can put a light, UVB light that's on a timer for like 10 hours on, 14 hours off, or 12-12, or sunrise, sunset, however you want to do that. But ball pythons don't necessarily need light, and I don't recommend using the bulbs that produce heat and light as the heating source, because when they go off at night, because you don't want to keep them on 24/7, then what are you going to use to produce heat? This you can leave on 24/7. As far as regulating this with a thermostat, when you're putting this on top of a screen enclosure, you run the probe just underneath the lid, and you can use heat-resistant zip ties or little metal ties and hang the probe a few inches below the actual where the bulb is, and that'll detect the temperature of the air in that area from that distance, and then when it reaches the temperature that you set, it'll turn the bulb off. So this is a very good option, especially when it comes to glass enclosures, because the whole top is normally open. Downfalls, these can get very hot. You don't want to actually touch the cones while they're running, because you can burn yourself. The bulbs themselves get to 3, 4, depending on the wattage, 500 degrees. And you want to make sure whenever you're using something like this that the end is ceramic and not plastic, to make sure it can withstand that heat. Otherwise, you're looking at potential fire hazards. But with this, you can also use a secondary heat source, more so with glass enclosures, and that is using things like heat mats, or another type, you can use the larger heat tape, or you can get pre-made heat tapes. I get my heat tape through Reptile Basics. This comes already pre-terminated, has the little plug thing in there. You'll just need to tape it onto the underside of a glass enclosure. You can also get the two-way tape to do that. With the heat mats, also on a thermostat, when it comes to probe placement for a heat mat, in between the mat and the undersurface of whatever you're trying to heat. And then you're going to want to get a temperature gun to be able to measure the actual surface temperature accordingly to get it dialed into exactly where you want it. You can use these types of things right underneath the glass with the overhead ceramic bulb to create that full thermal zone for the hot side. And you put this on the underside of the glass, hide and substrate and everything on top of where this is, heat source on the top of it. Then you have, you'll need 2 thermostats, or a thermostat with 2 probes to be able to regulate both of these. I do not recommend using any type of a rheostat or dimmer switch on the heat pads like this, because you don't know exactly where the temperature is. And with ambient temperatures fluctuating within your house, these can produce more heat than what might be necessary, and it can be very easily a situation where you're producing too much heat for your ball python and they could still get burned. So definitely use a thermostat, because that will take all of those types of things into consideration when you're getting that right temperature. I'm not a huge fan of these urethane mats, more so because of how they're designed. They work, but as you see, this one's still in the package, and this is not a rip on Zoom Ed or anything like that. I've had to replace a few of these over the years, so I stopped using them personally. But they use a thin wire as the heating element in the actual units, and they tend to fail a lot quicker than the actual heat tapes that are available. These tend to last a lot longer. They don't fail as often if they're properly regulated. Not saying that they don't fail, but they fail a lot less often. But using these types of things, you just want to be cautious and careful. Check it regularly to make sure that it's not bubbling or anything like that. The other thing that is a little inconvenient sometimes, depending on the type of enclosure that you're using, because these ones I don't recommend at all when it comes to PVC enclosures, because the plug unit is generally very thick and it can lead to rocking, and you don't want to put pressure on the actual unit, that area right there, because you'll have to leave it hanging out. Leaving this one hanging out, you're leaving all of that stickiness and everything like that to grab hair and everything else. just not recommended for the PVC at all. But these work normally for the glass because there's normally that lip. So these can work. Another type of an enclosure that the heat tape is good for is racks. That's predominantly how they are wired up, is they use various sizes of the heat tape. Power cables are connected to each of the terminals. The black that you see in here is a type of ink, essentially, that allows for the transfer of the electricity produces heat. These are a lot more efficient than the other pad is when it comes to power consumption. I mean, this little pad right here only takes like 7 watts worth of power, and that's at full blast. You putting it on a thermostat, it probably will run around 4 to 5 watts at most. Something like this is, I think, 11 or 12 watts per foot, watts max worth of power consumption. Again, once you connect it to a thermostat, it'll almost never run at full blast all the time, so very energy efficient. And when you're putting them in the racks, it goes, you can have it to where it goes underneath the tub. Some racks are devised to where it goes behind the tub. I prefer under the tub rack type systems when it comes to heating for any tub situation, because it provides an easier way to control that thermal gradient between the back and the front. And then the last type of heat source that I normally recommend, and this works really, really good when it comes to PVC style enclosures, is a radiant heat panel. This particular panel is a Pro Products Pro Heat heat panel. But you can also get the Vivarium electronics ones. Some people also use sweeter heaters. So there's a few options out there. I'm not a fan of the sweeter heater at all. I think they're underpowered more than anything. I prefer the Pro Heats over any of the other options when it comes to the radiant heat panels. These are actually built to commercial standards because the company that builds them builds these for commercial buildings, to heat commercial buildings. So they're built to last. And this will just mount on the PVC on the inside of an enclosure. You run the cable out. When it comes to the probe, you just have to have the probe hanging just a little below it, similar to the ceramic bulb, and then it detects the air temperature within that range wherever you're putting that probe to make sure that that area is reaching your desired temperature. If you want it at 88 degrees, right towards the bottom of the height, where the height is or something like that, put your probe in that general vicinity there, and once it hits 88 degrees, it shuts this right down. You can also use this in conjunction with heat tape underneath the enclosure. I generally don't recommend that if the enclosure is under 18 inches, as it's generally not necessary. But if the enclosure is like 2 feet or 3 feet tall, then using something like this along with a heat mat on the underside to create that zone is going to be a lot easier to maintain. The PVC isn't as good at conducting heat, but after it heats up, it holds it pretty good. And the inside of the enclosure, when you use something like this, it'll heat it right up without a problem. One of the other things to take into consideration when it comes to any of these heat sources is your ambient temperatures in your room. The colder your room is, the harder it's going to be to maintain that sweet spot for giving the thermal regulation in any enclosure, regardless if it's glass, PVC, or the rack systems, anything. You want to make sure that your ambient temperature is generally around the mid 70s at minimum. And that will make sure that the heat source that you're using doesn't overwork itself. It'll last a lot longer. It'll be more efficient in maintaining the proper temperatures for the hot side of the enclosure. And it gives that thermal gradient naturally when you have that ambient temperature. It's like these racks here. I have the temperature set for the hot spot to be around 88 to 90 degrees all the time. The front of the enclosures, because I keep my ambient temperature in my reptile room at around 74, 75 degrees year round. At any given time, I can measure the temperature inside the front portion of these tubs, and it's around 78 degrees, which is absolutely perfect for the cool side. So I have that thermal regulation. The hot side is at about 90 degrees. The cool side is just around the 80, 78, 80 degree range. So that's the easy method when it comes to helping regulate temperatures for having that thermal gradient when you're keeping ball pythons or a lot of different snakes, because this will apply to many different species, not just ball python. You get that regulation, you get that proper thermal gradient, and it helps. Some of the other pros and cons when it comes to using these types of things, the radiant heat panel and the ceramic heat emitter will tend to dry out substrates a little bit quicker than using the actual pads or the heat tape. Just with the way that it's blasting the extra heat. So you're going to have to watch your humidity. If you're using glass, it's notoriously difficult to keep the environment humid in the proper levels to begin with without like taping off the top of the enclosure and allowing very little room for that moisture to escape. Another concept with the heat panels as well, using these in a PVC enclosure, you generally don't have to worry about the moisture getting out as quickly, but it does still tend to dry things out a little bit quicker than using the heat tape. So things to take into consideration with whatever method you want to employ using when it comes to heating your enclosures. If you want to use a tub instead of a glass tank or a PVC tank, you can also use the heat mats on the tubs. I highly recommend, again, using something like this heat tape when it comes to using the tubs, especially with like the Sterilites or something like that, because of how thin that plastic is. I wouldn't use one of the thicker urethane mats. I would use something like this. Get this wired up properly, put your probe on the tape itself, set the tape down, and then put the tub right on top of it. You're measuring the temperature of the tape using your thermostat and keeping that regulated accordingly, and then you can use a temperature gun on the inside, because if you want a 90-degree hot spot inside, you might have to dial the tape temperature up to 91 or 92 in order to achieve what you actually want inside the enclosure. But that's the types of heating sources that I recommend as far as taking care of your ball pythons and giving them what they need for that heat variant and maintaining that. So again, that's the types of heat sources that I recommend. Again, I don't recommend using the actual light bulb sources, especially when it comes to ball pythons, as they're a lot harder to regulate for providing the proper heat, connecting to a thermostat, you need to get a special dimming thermostat. Otherwise, you're going to get the bulbs turning on and off all the time. So using the ceramics when it comes to glass enclosures, and even some of the PVC enclosures that have like the screen meshed tops, it would work perfectly fine in that situation as well. But using the urethane mat as a secondary type of source to combine the two is highly suggested, as that helps to create that whole thermal zone. And understanding that when you're doing something like that, you're going to need to have a thermostat that has two probes or two thermostats to be able to regulate both of the heating devices. And I can't stress enough to making sure that you have a good quality thermostat to make sure that things are regulated properly. And then lastly, the use of the radiant heat panels, which I really like when it comes to heating up a enclosure that's made out of PVC, as they're very efficient overall. Like I said, I've used the Pro Products one, I have the VE ones, I've used the Sweeter Heater ones. Pro Products is number one. The VE ones are okay. They have a couple of flaws that I am not completely happy with when it comes to some of the snakes being able to unplug them from inside of the enclosure. So you have to fiddle around with ways of preventing that. Whereas the Pro Products one, the cord is solidly attached. You run it right out the side of the enclosure. You don't have to worry about it coming unattached. And the Sweeter Heater just underperforms as far as the size of the heater for the size of the space that you're actually trying to heat up, because they don't come in many different sizes like either of the other two do. They generally only come in a couple of sizes. But that's what I recommend. If you have any other questions or comments, do leave them down in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you liked what I was discussing today, or if you found this informative. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe and that notification button so you get the notifications when I produce new videos. I'm trying to shoot for at least one video a week right now. I may do more or less depending on timing, but that's my goal as of right now, is to try to do at least one video a week. But until next time, have a great week.